Hi everyone, we're going to get started with our next session on developing apps for developing countries, presented by Jamie. I'm going to introduce Jamie. Jamie is a non-binary adventurer from Buffalo, New York, who wishes they were immortal so they'd have time to visit every coffee shop in the world. They're a Rails and Android developer doing both front-end and back-end work, and currently working as an engineer for AgriList, a data analysis platform for indoor agriculture. In their free time, they do advocacy in the transgender community, make podcasts and designs, and spend time in nature camping and hiking. So give your attention to Jamie. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My talk is called Developing Apps for Developing Countries. Thank you for coming to it. I have an intro slide, even though she just did a really good job introducing me. My name is Jameson, but you can call me Jamie. I'm here from Buffalo, New York, which is the home of bad sports. Really excited to be in Chicago. I work for AgriList. We do farm management and data analysis for indoor farms and greenhouses. We're located in Brooklyn, New York. And you can follow me on Twitter at JamieBash. I have posted the slides for this talk on my Twitter if you want to follow along. And feel free to tweet to me, although I do want to point out my pronouns are they, them, so if you're going to post about me, please keep that in mind. But actually I want to talk about Medicapt. And Medicapt is an Android app that I worked on at my old job. And it was designed to be used in third world countries to help prosecute sexual offenders, which is a really cool thing to work on. It was developed for an NGO called Physicians for Human Rights. I didn't work directly for them, I worked for a consulting agency that worked for them. And the idea behind Medicapt is basically that in a lot of countries, especially in Africa, sexual assault rates are pretty high, but then prosecution rates are pretty low. And one of the big reasons for that is that the rates of the assaults being reported are very low. And so the people at PHR thought that maybe one of the big reasons for that is that, women have to get these medical examinations, very invasive medical examinations after being assaulted. And they do it because they're worried about their health. But then to undergo additional invasive exams with law enforcement in order to report it is a huge barrier because they just at that point want to be over with it. So that's a big contribution on unreported crimes. So the idea behind Medicapt is well, what if doctors could do their initial examination and then record that information in a way that would be admissible as evidence to the court system? So that way at the end of the exam, they could say, okay, here are your results. Also, we've already have all of your information. Do you want to report this to the police? If so, all you have to do is say yes and sign here. You just have to consent, you don't have to do anything else. And then there's no more pain points. And they thought that would be more likely and it would help people there. Medicapt has won a few awards. It won the Humanity United Tech Challenge for Atrocity Prevention in 2013. And then it was also nominated for a Human Rights Tulip Award in 2015. That's when I was working on it in 2015. Wow, Jamie, that's really cool. How did you end up working on that? I'm really lucky. The consulting firm I was working for at the time was working with PHR on this app. And the PHR team was going to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo to test it, and they were hoping to bring someone from the technical team to do that. And at that point, I wasn't even working on the project yet, but I was the only person at my small little company who was willing to go to the DRC. So I literally learned how to program Android at that point, and I onboarded onto the Medicapt project. And I became the point person, and then I remained the point person for that project for about 2 years. And of course, I was interested in the app because it's not every day that we get to do something as developers that's really, really actively feels like you're doing something that's making the world a better place. So I totally jumped on that. And going into it, I knew there were going to be a lot of challenges. I was new to Android development in general, and I knew that writing for the third world was going to be a lot different. And so we talked a lot before I even got onto the project about the kinds of challenges that we were going to have to face. So these are some of the challenges that I was expecting. These ones are like medical issues because it was a medical app. Privacy concerns were really, really important because we were working with medical information and really sensitive medical information. So we thought about how to deal with that. One of the things we did is we required a PIN every time the app timed out. So you open your app and you log in, but then if you set it down on the counter for a minute, maybe you don't have to log in all the way, but you have to enter your PIN so that someone can't just pick up the phone and look at this really private information. And we also were like, okay, well, we don't want to store images. Normally if you have an app and you take pictures, it's going to save it also in your camera roll. We didn't want the liability of having those pictures just lying around on the phone, which might get used for something else. So we were like, well, we're going to have the pictures just in the app and we're not going to store them on the phone. There were also chain of custody concerns. Chain of custody isn't something that I was super aware of before I worked on this project, but it's basically the idea is you have to make a paper trail of who created and who edited and who accessed what files. And this is really important for law enforcement because you have to prove, who saw what and when they saw it. So these issues are they were really important to the app that we were building in particular, but they're not really unique issues. These are just constraints for this particular project that we're going to have to write code for. And every project has its own set of constraints, so that wasn't totally crazy. Lack of Wi-Fi was one that we talked about a ton. We're starting to get a little bit more unique to programming in the third world. Not totally unique, sometimes it's important to be able to use apps offline. That can be a big selling point. But this was a little bit more pressure than just, oh, people will really like it if you can use it offline, that'll be really useful. Because this is a really important function, and we know that we can't assume that they're going to be able to connect via data as a big backup. So we decided that we should use a NoSQL solution and rely on eventual consistency. That way they could create new records while they're offline, and they'd be stored locally on the phone temporarily, and then when they did get an internet connection, then they would sync all those records to our database, and then they would cease to be saved on the phone. So that was a huge core of the functionality of our app that we kind of planned to do in advance. And we also knew we were going to have an inexperienced user base. Good UX is also important, is important for every project, but it's kind of different to think about when you know that your target audience hasn't really used a lot of apps before. You can't really assume that the same things are going to be intuitive to them because the way that things become intuitive is because we have a similar shared background. If you've used if you've used phones before and you've used a lot of apps before, you go yeah, okay, the back button is up here. And we kind of rely on that shared intuition. So, this is a bunch of things to keep in mind, and I was ready. And I worked on the project for a little while, and then I actually went on this trip to Africa with them. And I met the PHR team, we had a really good time. We saw gorillas, which was really amazing. It was an amazing experience. And I also saw the situation there with the hospitals, and I worked with some of the doctors that would be using the app from there. And it made me realize that there was a whole other set of challenges that hadn't really ever even occurred to me. And it completely challenged how I was thinking about the project. It turns out that since I'm a programmer in the first world, I wasn't even able to predict the things that were going to be big issues very well. And I had to have a lot of empathy for this user base that I really didn't have that much in common with. We're used to making apps for people that, in the grand scheme of things, we have a lot in common with. They're very much like ourselves. I know we talk about oh, our users are so dumb or whatever, but not really. We more or less have a similar background living where we live and being familiar with this kind of technology. So this was different from that. And I found that the challenges that I actually faced were different from the challenges I expected to face. And the biggest one was lack of resources more than just Wi-Fi. I had spent a lot of time thinking about how to get around not having Wi-Fi, and I had planned a lot of the project about that, and then I realized there was just more to it than that. They wanted to do printing, but there were no printers in the hospitals. So I was all right, well, we're gonna have to do something about that at some point. They didn't even have reliable electricity in the hospitals. And this is something I wasn't expecting at all. And it was the first thing that really required some out-of-the-box thinking. You can't just magic up power out of nowhere. And when they were like, yeah, you know, we're gonna have to make sure this works, even when they're having rolling blackouts, my first thought was like, well, I can't do anything about that. If there's no electricity, the app's not gonna work. But it was something that we had to think about, like how we were gonna deal with that. Another thing is, like I said, we knew that the audience we were programming for was different than we were used to, but it turned out it was a very inexperienced user base. As frequent smartphone users ourselves, we didn't do a really excellent job predicting the kinds of things that they were going to find difficult, even though we had tried to think about this. A couple examples, clicking on the text box in order to type in it wasn't super intuitive to them. To me, that's so intuitive that I didn't even ever think twice about the fact, like, of course, you look at the screen, you click, and then you type. But that wasn't as easy as it was to me in my brain. And this is kind of just like a small thing, but it was one of the things that really stuck out in my mind is realizing that it was going to be different. But they were very unfamiliar with underscores, and we had made some test accounts that they could use while we were testing the app. And they had underscores in the usernames and they had underscores in the passwords, just because that's how we generated them. And the doctors didn't know how to make the phone make an underscore, which actually is not intuitive at all. Like, you have to go into punctuation, and then you have to go into like capitalize your punctuation, which actually makes no sense. I'm just so used to it that it's easy to me. And if we had thought about that, you know, it could have been a much more friendly experience for them testing the app and not having to worry about this thing that was just 2 seconds. I could have changed it if I had thought about it. There's also a lack of tech support in Africa, which maybe it was stupid of me not to think about. But, you know, if something breaks, there's no IT person around to fix it. We had thought about training. We were like, okay, well, when we launch the app, we're going to send over some developers and do these like week-long training classes. We're going to teach everyone how to use it. We were on top of that, but for some reason it didn't super occur to us that, like, okay, well, then after that week, we're going to leave, and they're going to have to continue using it forever, and even if it's not working right. So basically, we realized that everything needs to be really, really, really reliable. And also, because nothing can be 100% reliable, we need to have easy solutions so that they can fix it if something does go wrong. There were also trust issues. Obviously, that's not like an extremely technical issue, but it turns out a lot of the issues that we were facing weren't super technical. The users there didn't like the idea of the cloud. They wanted to be able to physically see the server. There were actually issues with that at the governmental level, where they were very touchy about the idea of the server being like outside of their borders. And like some people were just emotionally attached to writing it on paper too. So there was a lot of discussion on how to kind of convince people, like, no, it's okay. We know we know you have security concerns, but like we thought about them. We built the app around them. It's okay to try. Here's all the reasons why it's better. Again, maybe this is something that was naive of me not to think about. Like, you know, users who aren't very used to smartphones were hesitant to use them. That should have been obvious, but, you know, I'm a technical person. I was writing code, and I was so lost in the code that this kind of human issue was a little bit lost on me. And additionally, as a developer, it was a little bit out of my hands. But I participated in a lot of the discussions about it with the employees of the NGO while I was with them. And after that, it was kind of more on the forefront of my mind as I continued to work on this project, and that gave me a different perspective. So as you probably noticed, that was a lot different than the slides at the beginning where I talked about what I was expecting. And I'd already been working on the project for a while, so now we're like, okay, well, we got to pivot. How are we going to change the app to kind of deal with these things? How did we overcome these challenges? How did we take the things that were like, well, we just can't do that, and be like, well, we have to do it. Specialized equipment and market research was like a big part of it, and it's not something I would have expected at first. It turns out that you can hit a ton of these special considerations with the right hardware. I'm going to talk specifically about printing, because I printing was like one of the big things that I personally wrote in the app, and I spent a lot of my time doing it. So first off, we were lucky because, like I said, they didn't have printers, so the NGO decided, well, we're going to provide the printers, we're going to provide the hardware to them. And so I was in a really cool position where I got to do really extensive market research to recommend, what's going to be the best, what should they use, what should you buy for them and provide for them. And this was a huge benefit as a developer, because normally if you're programming, especially a mobile application, you have to think a lot about, well, I'm going to have a lot of different users who are using this on a lot of different devices, and it's going to have to work on all of those devices. And that wasn't the situation I was in here. I really only had to have this work correctly on one specific mobile phone that was paired with one specific printer. And it didn't really matter if it didn't work well on other devices. So that was unusual. And then I got to pick out the printer, which was really great too. So when I was testing printers, there were a few considerations that I was thinking about that would help it be useful, particularly in the third world. It had to have a portable size, because they were only going to have one printer per hospital to save money, and they needed to be able to move it around. It needed to be battery powered for the same reason, and a long battery life was going to be like a huge consideration. Removable lithium-ion batteries were also like a really great thing, because then you can buy more than one and have people charge them off-site where the electricity is more reliable, and then they would have backup batteries in case of rolling outages. So that was kind of how we started to deal with that first thing that I was like, no, I just can't do this. We were also looking at this point into portable backup chargers for phones to mitigate the other side of the power issue. Ease of use and error handling was a big thing because of the thing I said about not having IT. Some printers just blink lights at you for troubleshooting, and that's really confusing. A printer with a display that actually gives you words is much better and easier to use, especially if it can speak in French, because they speak French in the DRC, which is another thing that I was dealing with at every point in this project. And it had to be Bluetooth enabled. That was really, really important, because we weren't relying on Wi-Fi, but Bluetooth only requires proximity to other Bluetooth devices, so like that we were able to deal with. So that's a lot of really specific things that I needed. As you can imagine, there's not that many printers on the market that fit all of this criteria. In fact, there are 2. And I tested all 2 of them, and I was able to make a recommendation based on that. So that was really cool, actually. I liked doing that market research. It was different from my normal work, and it was really interesting. Non-standard solutions to problems was also a really big thing that we had to think about, and it was kind of a hard conclusion to come to in some ways, because we had to let go of this idea of like, yeah, we're just going to use off-the-shelf solutions, and we had to kind of come to terms with the fact that, yes, we're going to build a lot of this stuff from scratch. We were using Android, and one of the things that's really great about Android is that there are a lot of off-the-shelf solutions. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you want to do something. But for projects like this, maybe sometimes you do. And that was hard to get to. We didn't feel like we were doing something totally unique that had never been done before in the history of tech. And we were like, well, if someone's done it before, then there's already a solution somewhere. But the problem was that the very specific combination of constraints that we were working with were kind of playing off each other in a way that meant it was kind of unique. So a lot of the solutions we're finding, online on Stack Overflow or whatever, like didn't apply to us, and they'd be so close. Like, well, this would work if we could lose only one of our 6 constraints, but that's not really how constraints work. You can't just really just throw out the ones you don't like. So we kind of got stuck, and there were a few things we had to build from scratch, like the camera functionality, not to save the camera roll that I was talking about earlier. We weren't able to find that, so we built it ourselves. That wasn't a huge deal, it was just something that we had to do. But printing was another big issue, and that was like a big thing. We ended up using a custom Bluetooth solution where we're literally sending the info to the printer as a byte stream, which is like so backwards. But it was the only thing we could do. And we struggled for a million years trying to find an existing solution, and it just didn't exist. Android uses cloud printing. That was a problem because of the internet. There were also security problems where we didn't want to send to any other servers because of the information. It couldn't be any of the existing solutions. And if we had just come to terms with that from the beginning, we would have saved a lot of time. If we're like, okay, we're just gonna have to do it. We wasted a lot of time trying things that didn't work in the end. And we had to use this creative problem solving. We talk a lot about creative problem solving in tech, like being virtuous and innovative. But sometimes you just have to do it because it's literally the only way you can. We also ended up going with a very different kind of UI than I'm used to using. There was a decision made at some point to build the app in a way that spelled everything out at a really basic level for the user. Step-by-step instructions for every individual thing they had to do, and also built-in instructions for common problems so that they can troubleshoot it themselves if something went wrong. When I say step-by-step instructions, I'm talking you hit print. Okay, turn on the printer. You have to hit OK. You can't continue until you go, okay, I turned on the printer. Okay, now plug in the cord. Okay, I plugged in the cord. Now it doesn't let you proceed until you've done every instruction in order. Obviously, this is very, very different from how I design an app for the first world. In fact, if you're comfortable with a smartphone already, Metacapt would be really frustrating and awful for you to use because it would force you to go so slow and think so hard about each step. It would just drive you nuts. But for people that were having a lot of anxiety about using this device that they weren't used to, it was really helpful for them. So my conclusion is that in order to make a program that's usable and useful for an audience that we don't normally program for, there's a few things that we have to do. Think about their needs and how they're different from our needs, and gauge that. Live a day in somebody else's shoes in order to fully experience empathy for the less technical considerations, and that's what I experienced when I went to Africa and met the people that I was working for. And learn how to look at our own app with new eyes, and try to imagine what it would be like to experience it if it were someone else who was using it. This advice has a really cool bonus in that it's actually a good way to program apps all the time, not just for the third world. I had to work on this very specific project and I had to think about this really intensely, but I think that it made me a better programmer overall, and it made me a lot more considerate overall for different audiences, which I think is a really good skill to have. Thank you for listening. Again, you can follow me on Twitter, and this is my website. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. So does anybody have any questions at this time to ask Jamie? I can walk around. Yeah, of course.
You mentioned that you looked for some existing solutions to the Bluetooth printing and the not saving the camera roll. Did you open source your code or put it out there in a way that other people might be able to find it?
There was a lot of talk about that. Because I was working as a consulting, it wasn't our decision to open source or not. But at one point, PHR came to us and said, we want your recommendation on if we should open source this or not. And ultimately, we talked about it on our tech team, and we decided that we did want to recommend them to open source. We proposed that to them, and they decided, okay, well, then we will. But it wasn't ready to open source at that point. It hadn't been released yet. Actually, when I was in Africa, it was like a weird secret. They were like, you can't post on social media because people can't know that our NGO is visiting Africa when you can't know until you come back, and then you can tell people. So it was kind of weirdly secretive because it wasn't released yet. And so we basically made this decision, we're going to open source it, we're going to get it ready, and now we're going to build it knowing that we're going to open source it with that in mind. And by the time I left that company and left that project, we weren't at that point yet, but as far as I can tell, it still hasn't been fully released. That beta applications of this have been released, but the full version I don't believe has. So as far as I know, they're still planning to open source that at that point.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much.